Okay guys, hope all of you are well. I am again coming back here. Today I am going to discuss some current topics and its relation with static portion. One of the recent controversies going on regarding National Judicial Appointment Commission NJAC, which has been struck down by Supreme Court considering it as ultra vires of the Constitution. Now the thing is that UPSC's champions does not ask question directly from the current topic. It asks question from the background of the current topic, and for this we should know how to relate the current topic with the static portion. For this, first we have to see, or we have to consider how this recent controversy is related with our how this recent controversy is related with our static portions of GS2 paper. In my consideration, this recent controversy has introduced two static topics. One is basic structure of the Constitution and another is separation of power. Then in case of separation of power, what we have to consider? Okay, how we have to cover the topic? First, I have divided the topic separation of power in three parts: history, current and future. In history, what we have to see? We have to see the history means the thinkers, philosophers. What are the thinkers who have propounded about the theory of separation of power? What was the view of Plato? What is the view of Aristotle, and what is the view of Montaigne? What is the reason why they thought that separation of power among different organs are necessary? Why it is necessary? If there is no separation of power, how it would be harmful, how it will concentrate power on one organ of the government, how it will temper democracy. Means in this portion we have to see. In terms of history, we have to consider three things. First thing is that who are the thinkers or philosophers who have propounded the theory of separation of power. Second thing is that what are their views about the separation of power. And third topic is very dynamic and most important topic. You can use in a comparative way that what are the socio-political backgrounds that compel these thinkers to propound the theory of separation of power. In what is situation Rousseau, Montaigne, Plato, Aristotle were compelled to give such a theory, such an idea of separation of power in case of government. Why they propounded such theory? What are the socio-political backgrounds, and how you can introduce that socio-political background in at present situation? If you compare the past and present, then you can find out an idea that what is the importance of separation of power. This comparison is very necessary because it will give you a dimension that to think that what is the necessity of separation of power. Now come to current topic. In current topic, what you have to consider? We have to consider separation of power in terms of Indian Constitution. First thing is that you have to see whether Constitution Assembly has been explicitly mentioned, explicitly included the provision of separation of power in Indian Constitution. If it is not explicitly visible, then how we can analyze separation of power in Indian Constitution or in Indian scenario? How we analyze this? Right. What are the different characteristics of separation of power in India in Indian scenario? The another two most important topics that have been introduced by separation of power are. Another two most important topics introduced by separation of power is judicial review and judicial activism. Again, we have to consider that what is judicial review. Whether the judicial review is explicitly mentioned in Indian Constitution, if not, how it is implicit. In what are the articles of Indian Constitution where we can implicitly derive the idea or notion of judicial review. And if it is anywhere explicitly mentioned in the Indian Constitution, then what are the articles which have explicitly mentioned about judicial review? From which articles we can derive the idea of judicial review? What is the purpose of judicial review? Right, how it is introduced in Indian Constitution, with which purpose judicial review is introduced in Indian Constitution. And we have to also examine that what is the pros and cons of judicial review, whether it gives a fair chance to judiciary whether it has given a fair chance to judiciary to override any legislative act unnecessarily, whether it has given a fair chance to judiciary to interfere in a legislative act unnecessarily, whether in India there is any example of judicial review where it has been seen that judiciary has unnecessarily interfered in a legislative act. If there is any example of such unnecessary use of judicial review by judiciary, what are these examples? Right, we have to consider these things in case of judicial review. First, we have to see that what are the articles or provisions of Indian Constitution which give us the notion of judicial review. We have to see these things. Then we have to consider what is the purpose of introduction of judicial review. Third, we have to see that what is the relevance of judicial review. Third, we have to see what is the relevance of judicial review. Is there any example where judiciary has unnecessarily interfered in legislation? Right, we have to consider these three things regarding with judicial review. Then another most important topic is judicial activism. Then what is judicial activism? We have to compare judicial activism with judicial review. What is the differences or basic distinction between judicial review and judicial activism? What is the method used by judiciary for judicial activism? For one example, PIL, public interest litigation, is one of the methods that has been used by judiciary as a method of judicial activism. Now our duty is to examine the relevance and effectiveness of public interest litigation. To what extent public interest litigation or judicial activism has been able to fulfill the desired goals at current scenario. Right, in this way we have to consider judicial review and judicial activism and separation of power in terms of Indian Constitution. What are the provisions of Indian Constitution related to separation of power, judicial review, judicial activism? What is the necessity? What are the purposes? And the third thing is that whether they have been able to achieve the desired goals, whether there is an instance where these things, whether judicial activism or judicial review has been used unnecessarily, and whether these judicial review and judicial activism have been unnecessarily used to override any legislative act. What are the current conflicts between judicial review and separation of power? Whether judicial review is beneficial, whether judicial review is an effective tool to shape the balances what is the interlink between judicial review and separation of power? We have to consider all these things here. And another thing is that here we have to relate National Judicial Appointment Commission with all these things. We have to consider how separation of power, judicial review and judicial activism, these three things are interlinked with National Judicial Appointment Commission. In what power? Under which provision Supreme Court has struck down National Judicial Appointment Commission? Is it judicial review? Right, whether the Supreme Court has rightly struck down the NJAC or not. Right, whether it can be an example of judicial hierarchy or whether it is a right example of judicial review or perfect implementation of judicial review. We have to consider all these things. Now come to the third person, future. In case of future, you have to prepare a very logical note regarding the separation of power, judicial review and judicial activism. How it will affect Indian democracy. What is the future of Indian democracy under these provisions? Whether we have to examine right from the independence till this moment, how this judicial review, judicial activism and separation of power has affected Indian democracy. Whether they have given an extra voice to Indian democracy, to Indian people, whether they are used for protection of fundamental rights of Indian Constitution. We have to examine the future and relevance of all these things under this future portion. And in my next lecture, I will discuss the basic structure of Constitution, how this topic has introduced the basic structure of